Astro Royale, the latest manga by the Tokyo Revenger guy, is a story about superpowered gangs fighting each other. Now, on paper, that would sound interesting, but in execution, it turned out to be an insanely boring manga. But to understand why, we need to go over the bad habits of the author first. The start at a basic level really highlights the author's bad writing habits, that mostly being his fixation with writing gang-based stories, but seemingly romanticizing them rather than being realistic, creating some insane gangs of justice that fight the evil gangs, instead of understanding that's not how that works properly. He grew up in a gang, and the effects of it caused him to have a troubled school life, and troubles in his development into society. So with that in mind, you would think his writing would be more retrospective on the problems with gangs and why being in them is so bad, but instead his storytelling seems to take gang culture and wrap it into something vastly more bizarre. Lines like, "It takes an outlaw to beat an outlaw," and the police randomly going to Yakuza for help, as though this is normal or common, is insanely abnormal. Well, I did some research into the topic showing something about police tolerating Yakuza having these specific interactions seems to be incredibly strange and unrealistic. This makes all the conflicts going forward in the story just come across as goofy and hard to take legitimately, though the wonky power system is a larger part of the problem of this story losing me. So one day, a shooting star grants everyone who made a wish on it, on that day, the superpower called an Astro, which in order to use, needs an item called a link. So in theory, every link is an important item to a character is attached to, in some way, shape, or form. But the story does not really go into detail on what most of these links meant to people and are often superficial and one-dimensional. With a power system based on wishing for anything that being turned into a power, you would assume a lot of these wishes would be interesting or more abstract in terms of a character getting something like, oh, big buff guy, but his power is based on infinite ice cream or something. But instead what we get is a power system where people just get overly standard powers that are way too basic and repetitive. A good chunk of them is literally just, I punch hard type powers with no extra depth to them, and some of them are purposely bad or blatantly uncreative for reasons we're about to get into later. Some of them are just bad for not making sense or being so predictable. One guy can shapeshift, but it's because he wants to be able to make silly faces again, which doesn't make sense with his backstory since he must still have the ability to move his facial muscles in order to be able to make those expressions while he's transformed, but you know what? No, he just got shapeshifting. You would think with his desire to find the ability to make happy faces again, he would get some happiness juice power or something. But no, he just got shape-shifting, even though it's borderline tangential. Then this guy has a shield because he wants to protect the gang, so he just has a generic shield. One guy asked to lose calories and got a healing power, even though it's unrelated, and even the main character is just some boring punch-hard guy. The power system, despite the fact it could have been good in terms of concepts, instead ends up boring and predictable, which makes the fights all bad to watch, which for an action manga is an issue. But a bigger issue is the fact it's been 2 weeks since the power system in-universe became part of their society, but they somehow have a meta on how all the powers work despite it not making sense in-universe. For that to be the case, removing any interesting sense of exploration. And also, a lot of the fights have a bunch of bad guys who have these powers but are just fodder for the heroes to punch. For an example of the fights failing, in this chapter we get a Scooby-Doo plotline with a boring twist and two villains ripped directly out of One Piece. This premise is the house is haunted, but the twist is they're just Astro users scaring people to steal from them. I've seen this premise used in other media, but the problem is with a fresh power system with no real standards yet, the limit of what can be done is not established, so the twist has no point. They could have had the actual power to control ghosts, and narratively it would have been just as expected for the plot at this point. Though, for context, their actual power is the ability to control wax and to hypnotize people with their scents. But the power just happens to not work on women. And the way the chapter gets solved is there's randomly now a girl in the group with the convenient power to be invisible and then says some of the most cringe dialogue you would expect from the situation. Literally, the entire chapter is laying down how she's a girl as some godsend, which, while I can't off the top of my head remember it happening before, I definitely remember a lot of media having the same goofy intro to their female cast members, basically making the fact they're a girl the only notable thing about them. Anyway, the whole fight's conclusion as just some convenient way for a new character to show up in a specific instance, then go right into being mostly useless. Though the story is still early, the fact she had the chance to be useful, but didn't in later fights, says a lot about what's going to happen to her going forward. Now, this fight also has something pretty goofy. The trans character happens to make a scent to hypnotize people, but it only works on men. The question is, does this work on, say, trans men? Does it work on, say, trans women? Does it actually function on some form of mentality? Or does it simply work on biology? Then, if so, does that mean it could work on the user themselves? The ability presented is one that needs larger clarifications, since it needing to work on only men raises a lot of issues, such as does it work on the user's interpretation? As such, if they see somebody as male, it works, but if they see them as female, it doesn't. What if the girl was a tomboy instead and looked like a dude? Would it work based on them being viewed as a male, or is it purely the target's own idea of self? This could have been a moment for larger world building to explain these types of powers and how they would function going forward, but instead it's just cheaply used for some unnecessary character introduction when it needed deeper levels of exploration, so we get better insights going forward for more of these illusionary powers. The next fight covers how bad the dialogue is overall in Astro Royale. A little girl shows up and she's randomly meets the main character, then shows up to purposely have a bad superpower. I told you that I was going to go into this. To then get it destroyed by some rando with a cliche villain motives, and she just says the most bought dialogue. The main character stands up to Mr. Bad Guy, then she just goes on about how she won't cry because her dead dad told her to be strong and never cry. This is entirely unprompted, by the way. No one said anything to make her talk about this. Now, this is also an example of the author making powers in circumstances that are illogical. She got the power to make a 4-leaf clover out of a 3-leaf clover to give to her mom, who's sick in the hospital, by the way. Now, a clever author instead would realize most people, if they had the power to make a wish, they would wish to heal said loved one, so the power would not be this nonsense, or they would expand on it to actually be used in interesting ways, like having the clovers be any size, so you can make like mega-sized plants to help out, or make an infinite value of them to distract people, maybe even give them luck powers. But instead, he made the most useless sounding power useless and just moved on. Then the fight with this guy and his goons continues, and this happens. Dude got stabbed in the neck, but because he's him, he just broke the blade, then used the bad guy as a knife. And this made Astro Royale insanely goofy and hard to take seriously, since up till now we assumed most of what happened was done with the Astro powers. But he did not have any powers during this circumstance, and this was just his base biology, so now our idea of what these characters can handle is all over the place and irrelevant. The author, if he wants to convince us a character is hurt, is now going to work infinitely harder to make it feel natural. At the end of the fight, they take the random girl to the hospital where she learns the cliche lesson, "It's fine to cry if it's in joy." Then they move on to fight the big bad guy, and the entire interaction feels like filler that didn't add anything of value to the story. Now, the next bad guy actually has a creative power to control ants that's mostly used creatively, but the solution is just a boring punch bad guy hard and just win instead of applying enough pressure to distract him to let the stealth character be useful. Instead, the main character just solos the entire fight by just showing up, and then what we get is likely the first in a long string of bad guys getting flashbacks to make them seem important or deep while they're losing. I was going to cover the next fight in this segment going over them, but this now goes right into character acting being unconvincing and boring. I already somewhat covered the little girl as an example, but in one of the first fights in the story, the main character fights his best friend, and for some reason, despite the fact he did not know his friend got a power, he charged at him with lethal level force, even though it would be at risk of his own life. Once again, he did not know his friend had powers. He just charged at him and got lucky his friend could protect his own life. This shows the author not knowing how to write interactions on a realistic basis. This makes the characters less compelling and also goes into another character throwing a car at a skyscraper with no idea how he would survive the interaction, and the main character somehow falling asleep on a moving car with the artwork and paneling failing hard to convey what the author intends. While art is subjective, I think trying to set up a joke with no actual effort is a clear failure. The character had no signs of falling asleep or even getting on the car tired in the first place, so when he did fall asleep, it just felt like a cheap gag, and badly handled, since the logic of falling asleep on a moving car, while it could be good, instead ends up being illogical and unfunny. If he just added a drawing of him at least being tired or getting on the car in the first place, it would be something. But now the question on my mind is, how did his friends not notice he fell off immediately? How did he not end up waking up the moment he fell? This is extremely obnoxious types of writing where you don't actually think over what exactly is supposed to happen because, oh, it's a joke, and it causes the joke to just not land. On other notes, the artwork and paneling is lacking, with the poor shading being highly noticeable. You would think the Tokyo Revenger manga with this experience would know to apply it to make sure the light source makes sense. Now, some art styles don't really use shading, but that's mostly because they're very cartoonish. But even then, some shading is used to need to apply depth. While the manga does use some shading, the application is all over the place and inconsistent in a lot of panels. In this panel, the hand is not only drawn poorly with the anatomy of the hand not making sense, the shading is also not accurate to the direction of the light source. If we were to apply basic shading, it would look more like this. It's clear he wanted to do some perspective shot, but he messed up heavily. There's a lot of other panels like this, with some wonky artwork, weird dildo head necks, and some lack of polish to most of it. I almost think it's intended to look bad, but one of the more aggressive issues with the manga is the main character's eyes and the female character's body proportions. For the main character, his eyes look completely out of place with the more realistic face shapes of the other characters in his own story, making it look so jarring and weird. Now, the women in the story look off-model constantly, with the proportions being off anytime the artist needs to draw anything in perspective, and even for simple poses. According to some people I showed this to, her breasts look so off they come across as some dude's chest rather than a woman's. Looking at the artist's early work on Tokyo Revengers, his art declined so heavily from the start of the series. His anatomy and perspective all became infinitely worse than before, which makes the fall off almost comical. How do you decline this heavily to the point your work looks like it was made before the other? Astro Royale, based on artwork, you would assume it made before Tokyo Revengers, but instead, it's as though he just grew backwards, which makes everything about this manga almost sad to watch. Some of you might be wondering, why haven't I talked about any of the characters so far? The answer is simple. Most, if not all, these characters are so boring that I feel no value to discuss them. One of them wants to punch hard to be Mr. Hero and be heroic gangster. The other wants to help the gang as well. Another is just an emo. And the girl just exists, and will probably just be there to be there. And the only real villain so far got a one-piece flashback of him being a cannibal and trying to bite someone's fingers off because he got bullied for having weird teeth. This is basically being bullied for looking like a school shooter than being a school shooter. But his only response was fearing his dad grounding him for biting somebody's fingers off. "Oh, dad's gonna kill me. No Xbox for a year" type dialogue we expect from some Nicktoons live action show. Motherfucking Fresh Prince ass. But anyway, as we can see, the dialogue is pretty much composed of bots and cheese, with the fights being even more boring and poorly thought out, making them uninteresting, so the plot is easy to drop. I would recommend not reading this one. It's a 3 out of 10 at best. The plot could have been good if the writer handled the concept better, like making the fights better and making the characters more developed than just surface level values. I still only see the girl one as just a woman with no personality other than being a girl. You could at least say Ochako has like a goal to play for her parents as a hero, right? You could at least say Bulma was an intelligent and self-censored person, but this chick so far is just woman with nothing else to her. So if Astro Royale somehow doesn't get cancelled, I hope for them to start developing the characters and start trying more with the art to improve the quality of the work, because the art shown is all so below average for what the quality should be at for him. Being a pro and all, but having Web 2 quality artwork is shameful. Like, these panels, hard to read, this story, weird looking, so much of it just looks awkward and hard to like put your eyes on without feeling like it's some bizarre joke. But yeah, I would honest to God say that people should not like read the story. If you see my points as correct, unlike the fools in the world, like and subscribe. Have a nice day. Ciao.